This week's PowerPoint talks about movement. It will be a review of many topics we've had already, including upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. What we're trying to do this week is pull it all together into one package. This slide lists 4 components that functional movement needs to have. It needs to be voluntary, chosen by us for a functional reason. We need to remember motor programs or patterns of movement that we have learned. We need to be smooth and coordinated, and movement needs to be started and stopped correctly. Each of these 4 functions of movement utilizes a primary brain region or circuit, all of which need to work together in order to allow movement to be as functional as possible. We're going to start with looking at voluntary or volitional movement. The control of movement is sometimes called motor control. It is complex, and as the slide says, it is distributed over a number of different regions and circuits within the central nervous system. Some parts are hardwired, such as reflexes, which are not voluntary, and others are learned. These are voluntary functions. And most of the time when we move, we're using a combination of both voluntary and involuntary control systems. When we decide we want to perform a volitional or voluntary movement, this motivation begins in the prefrontal cortex, which is shown on the slide by the red arrow. That connects to or projects to the primary motor cortex, which is shown on the slide as the blue precentral gyrus that you're already familiar with. So we will have axons that project or connect from prefrontal cortex to primary motor cortex. This slide shows primary motor cortex with the red arrow as the blue strip of precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe. And as you know, the major descending tracts, particularly the lateral corticospinal tract, begin on the primary motor cortex. So this is really where voluntary movement begins, even though the decision to move actually started in the prefrontal cortex. The upper motor neuron cell bodies are located here on primary motor cortex. The lateral corticospinal tract contains upper motor neurons which connect the primary motor cortex to lower motor neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. And as you already know, each primary motor cortex controls skeletal muscle on the contralateral side of the body. This little schematic diagram shows how upper motor neurons control lower motor neurons, which in turn cause skeletal muscle to contract. And it's this pathway that allows us to have voluntary or volitional movement. Upper motor neurons, then lower motor neurons, then muscle. Upper motor neurons form the cortical spinal tracts that control muscles of the body, and also the cortical bulbar or cortical nuclear tracts that control skeletal muscle in the head. Corticonuclear and cortical bulbar tracts are 2 terms for the same structures. In other words, upper motor neurons that are responsible for controlling lower motor neurons found in the cranial nerves. When there is an injury to upper motor neurons, there will be paralysis, in other words, loss of voluntary control of muscle, as well as hypertonia and spasticity. And some common causes of upper motor neuron lesion are listed on the slide: brain injury, spinal cord injury, and stroke, or CVA. Lower motor neurons are neurons that have their cell bodies in the spinal cord or brainstem, and that synapse directly onto skeletal muscle. Lower motor neurons form all of the spinal nerve, part of all of the spinal nerves, and part of some of the cranial nerves. An injury to a lower motor neuron will cause paralysis, loss of voluntary movement, as well as hypotonia or flaccidity. And several causes of lower motor neuron lesion are listed here. Polio, which is a virus that infects alpha motor neuron cell bodies, causes lower motor neuron injury. And also peripheral nerve injury, for example, something like carpal tunnel syndrome, which is damage to a spinal nerve, the median nerve. Lower motor neurons need to be activated by sensory neurons from a reflex or by upper motor neurons. The definition of a reflex is an involuntary response to a stimulus. This slide diagrams a couple of reflexes, one of which has two neurons, a blue sensory neuron and a red motor neuron, the other of which has three neurons, a blue sensory neuron, a black interneuron, and a red motor neuron. Reflexes are always located at the level of the spinal cord or brainstem, and they can be controlled or modified by higher brain sensors, for example, from the reticulospinal tracts, the lateral corticospinal tracts, or the vestibulospinal tracts. This diagram shows the simple or monosynaptic stretch reflex, which has a sensory neuron bringing in an afferent action potential from a muscle spindle, a synapse in the spinal cord, and then a lower motor neuron that connects the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle extrafusal fibers. You've seen this reflex before. It can be used clinically to diagnose upper or lower motor neuron injuries, but it has no known physiological function. This slide again shows the progression between upper motor neurons, lower motor neurons, and skeletal muscle cells, and shows that any interruption to this pathway will cause paralysis, defined as loss of voluntary movement. Muscle tone is defined as the degree of a muscle's passive resistance to stretch. It results from two components. One is the mechanical component, which is produced by the physical properties of the skeletal muscle cells and the connective tissue that wraps or invests the skeletal muscle cells, and the neural component, which is caused by stimulation of a small number of motor units within the skeletal muscle. Some motor units in every skeletal muscle are always on in order to produce tone. They take turns, so no motor unit gets tired. As we've already learned, it is the responsibility of the gamma loop reflex to control and adjust muscle tone. This reflex begins by a gamma motor neuron that is sending an action potential to the muscle spindle or intrafusal muscle cells, the nuclear bags and nuclear chains. This stimulates an action potential in the afferent or sensory neuron, which is shown in yellow on this slide, which synapses onto the blue alpha motor neuron, which causes contraction of the extrafusal fibers and produces tone in the skeletal muscle. Tone can be modified by the environment and one's emotional state, as well as by upper motor neurons in all three tracts, particularly the reticulospinal tract. All three of these mainly dampen down tone. This slide summarizes lesions to upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. In both cases, the connection between the primary motor cortex and the muscle is broken. The result of that is paralysis. In an upper motor neuron lesion, because the gamma loop is disinhibited, tone will increase, causing a hypertonic or spastic muscle. In a lower motor neuron lesion, the gamma loop itself is affected, so the muscle is hypotonic or flaccid. There is no tone in the muscle. In a lower motor neuron lesion, because the lower motor neurons to the muscle have been damaged, the muscle is directly denervated and there is substantial atrophy or shrinkage of skeletal muscle. This is a result of the loss of acetylcholine, which is supposed to be released at the neuromuscular junction and helps to maintain health and the normal size of the muscle. In a person with an upper motor neuron lesion, the lower motor neuron is intact, so there is some atrophy of the muscle, but mainly due to disuse rather than loss of acetylcholine. So this is a good slide to know because it summarizes and compares and contrasts the two different types of motor neuron injuries. Signs and symptoms of lower motor neuron injury are summarized on this slide. They include paralysis or weakness and paresis, and sometimes some of both, substantial muscle atrophy, and flaccidity or hypotonia, in other words, loss of tone in the muscle. Whether you get paralysis or paresis depends on whether all or only some of the alpha motor neurons innervating a skeletal muscle have been damaged. Upper motor neuron signs and symptoms are summarized on this slide. They include paralysis or paresis, and here again, the difference depends on whether all or only some of the upper motor neurons that are innervating lower motor neurons to its skeletal muscle have been injured. There is also spasticity and hypertonia, increased tone in the muscle, and some muscle atrophy, although less than what you would see with a lower motor neuron injury. A second important component of functional movement is the ability to store motor memories or motor programs. So we need to remember patterns of movement that we have learned. In the next few slides, we'll review the parts of the brain that are responsible for this function. The supplementary motor cortex or motor area, the SMA, located in the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex, is responsible for storing motor learning or programs of movement. It has many connections to primary motor cortex, which directs the contraction of voluntary skeletal muscle. A lesion to the SMA, the supplementary motor area, will cause a condition called apraxia, also known as a motor planning deficit. There are many different forms of apraxia. You may see this type described as motor apraxia. People with this condition are not paralyzed, but they cannot learn new patterns of movement or remember old patterns of movement. This will give them a great amount of difficulty doing their activities of daily living. So, as an example of that, using tools appropriately, such as the toothbrush shown in this picture. Often people with motor apraxia will not know what to do with the toothbrush or will use it inappropriately, for example, to comb their hair. The third essential component of functional movement is that it needs to be coordinated. It needs to be smooth, efficient, accurate. The next few slides will review the parts of the brain responsible for this characteristic of functional movement. The cerebellum is the part of the brain that has primary responsibility for movement coordination. It is responsible for directing the timing, force, and direction of movement so that movement is smooth and accurate, fluid, flowing, and efficient. And if you look at people who get paid a lot of money in order to hit balls with sticks, as is evident in this slide, those are people who have a well-developed, well-myelinated cerebellum. They're very coordinated. This lateral view of the brain shows the cerebellum. The blue arrow is pointing to it. It is located underneath the occipital lobe and posterior to the brainstem. The cerebellum has two lobes, a right one and a left one, connected by a central region, as is shown in this picture on the left side of the screen. This slide is the mid-sagittal section of the brain, and the cerebellum is colored in blue with the red arrow pointing to it. The cerebellum can be subdivided into three functional regions. The vestibulocerebellum, shown on the bottom, is responsible for coordinating muscles used mainly for balance. The spinocerebellum, shown in the center of the cerebellum, is mainly responsible for coordinating muscles used for gait and posture. And the pontocerebellum, or neocerebellum, or cerebrocerebellum, shown on the lateral part of the cerebellum, in the light blue at the left, is responsible for execution of movements, and especially for movements that require fine coordination, such as movements of the hands and fingers, or movement of the vocal muscles, muscles of the lips and tongue that are used for speech. Here's a summary of the three functional regions of the cerebellum that I described on the previous slide. The vestibulocerebellum is responsible for coordinating muscles used for balance. The spinocerebellum coordinates muscles used for posture and gait. And the cerebrocerebellum, sometimes also called the pontocerebellum, as it is on this slide, coordinates muscles used for fine motor skills. So for completely normal coordination, you need all three functional regions of the cerebellum to work together. In order to do its job of making movement coordinated, the cerebellum needs to receive input from the proprioceptors in muscles, joints, and tendons, and from the inner ear. This comes in through the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8. The cerebellum does not have any direct connection to skeletal muscle. Instead, it sends output to the SMA, the supplementary motor area, for motor programs and motor planning, and it has connections to the primary motor cortex, where it directs the contraction of muscles by means of the upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. Damage to the vestibulocerebellum will produce a condition known as truncal ataxia. It's also sometimes called postural tremor. Patients who have this deficit sway back and forth when they are standing. And if you click on the link, you will see a patient who has a lesion to this part of the cerebellum. Injury to the spinal cerebellum produces a condition known as gait ataxia. People who have this condition might appear as if they're drunk. Their gait is very staggering, and their legs are often splayed wide apart, which is there to increase their base of support to keep them from falling over. If you click the link shown here, you should see an example of a patient with a spinocerebellar deficit and a case of gait ataxia. Deficits to the spinocerebellum can also result in the conditions shown on this slide, which include dysmetria, in which you're unable to judge the accurate distance of a movement to pick up an object or touch an object accurately, and intention or action tremor. In this tremor, when someone is reaching for an object, say to pick up a bottle of water, there will be a shaking of the upper extremity. Dysdiadochokinesia is the inability to perform rapid alternating movement. An example of that is to quickly pronate and supinate your radial-ulnar joint. And finally, spinocerebellar deficits can cause a condition in which movements are jerky and robotic rather than smooth and fluid. So think of a robot moving. That's called movement decomposition. So you want to know the definition of these 4 terms and be able to identify all of them as belonging to the spinocerebellum. Because the cerebrocerebellum is responsible for coordinating muscles used for fine motor movements, damage to this part of the cerebellum will produce ataxia, or uncoordinated movement of the hands and fingers, as well as dysarthria. This is where speech is slurred because it is difficult to carefully and accurately coordinate the muscles that are used for speech, muscles of the lip, tongue, and vocal cords. This slide lists some other causes of cerebellar problems. You're not responsible for memorizing what's on this slide, but it's just there for learning. There are a variety of inherited ataxias which are caused by genetic defects. Most of these are not fatal, but they can cause problems with movement. You can acquire ataxia from anything that could damage your brain, such as a stroke, a brain infection, multiple sclerosis, or a brain injury. Essential tremor is a benign condition that is inherited. Katharine Hepburn had this, and if you watch one of her later movies, you can see her head bobbing gently in the movie. And multiple system atrophy, or olivopontocerebellar atrophy, is another condition that we don't know the cause of, which can cause ataxia and causes damage to neurons in the pons as well as in the cerebellum. This slide makes an important point about cerebellar lesions. They always affect the ipsilateral side of the body. Click these 2 links in order to watch some people with ataxia, and you'll see that it is unilateral in these folks. And then see if you can predict which side of the cerebellum is the one that's affected. This slide shows the upper motor neuron controlling the lower motor neurons controlling the skeletal muscle. And I've added the cerebellum in the left part of the slide to show that the cerebellum works on this pathway by directing activity of the upper motor neurons, which in turn tell the lower motor neurons what to do, which in turn cause contraction of skeletal muscle. So the cerebellum is not directly innervating any lower motor neurons, and it's not directly sending any action potentials to muscle. It's working through the upper motor neurons and the descending spinal cord tract. Finally, functional movement needs to be started and stopped when we want it. And the next few slides will talk about the brain regions and circuits responsible for this aspect of functional movement. The basal ganglia are a group of interconnected brain structures located very deep within the cerebral hemispheres. They're listed here on this slide and shown in the picture: the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the subthalamic nucleus, which is part of the circuit but is not shown here. There are 5 functional circuits that these basal ganglia structures form within the central nervous system. And one of these functional circuits is responsible for movement initiation and inhibition. Some of the most important basal ganglia functions with respect to movement are listed on this slide. The basal ganglia are responsible for initiating movements and stopping movement. That's what cessation means. They also are responsible for the correct amount of muscle force, for sequencing movements properly, and for multi-joint movements. The basal ganglia circuit is responsible for our inner drive to move. You can see this if you look at a room full of 4-year-olds. They have a large inner drive to move, and they squirm and can't sit still all the time. If you compare them to a group of 80-year-olds, the 80-year-olds will sit much stiller. And the inner drive to move is directed by the basal ganglia circuit. They're also responsible for initiating emotion and cognition, which are not strictly movement functions, but can be affected by damage or deficits in the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia receive dopamine from the substantia nigra, which is in the midbrain, and also they get input from the cerebral cortex, and they send output to both the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. This slide is a horizontal section through the brain, and parts of the basal ganglia are shown. The names are circled in red, and you can follow the lines to see where they are in the horizontal section. Here's a frontal section of the brain, also showing parts of the basal ganglia circled in red. This slide presents a very simplified basal ganglia circuit. There's one in your book that's more complex than this, but I suggest looking at this one in order to make sense of it. Start at the bottom left part of the slide with the substantia nigra, which you know is in the midbrain. The substantia nigra releases dopamine, which has a stimulatory effect on the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia then stimulate the primary motor cortex with the neurotransmitter glutamate, which in turn causes contraction of skeletal muscle by way of upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. As you know, lower motor neurons release acetylcholine to cause contraction of skeletal muscle. This is a quick review of the function of dopamine. It is made in the brainstem, specifically in the substantia nigra. There are two tracts in the brain that involve dopamine. The one called nigrostriatal tract is responsible for movement and initiating that, as well as for initiating thought and emotion. And that's shown by the green tract on the slide. The other tract, which I haven't talked about, is the mesocortical tract. This goes to various parts of the frontal lobe and limbic system, and is the tract that's responsible for a feeling of pleasure or reward when we do something that we enjoy. This is the tract that is the one that is overactive in people who are addicted to something. When the basal ganglia are underactive, it usually results from decreased dopamine production from the substantia nigra, or something that affects the transmission of dopamine from the substantia nigra to other parts of the basal ganglia. Here's the basal ganglia circuit you saw before, but now dopamine has been removed. So there's a deficit of dopamine. That means the basal ganglia are not being stimulated, the motor cortex is not being stimulated, and contraction of skeletal muscle will be inhibited. It's different from paralysis because the primary motor cortex still controls the skeletal muscle. It's just that the primary motor cortex is not being stimulated to the level that it should in order to get normal initiation of movement. The most common movement disorder is Parkinson's disease, and this results from a deficit of dopamine from the substantia nigra. As neurons in the substantia nigra that produce dopamine die, there is a gradually decreased output to the motor cortex, so it is difficult to contract or initiate contraction of skeletal muscle. Again, this is not paralysis, but movements are slow and small, and people almost seem to be frozen sometimes. This slide is a cross-section through the midbrain. On the right side, you can see some of the black stuff where there is melanin that results from production of dopamine synthesis. On the left side, inside the blue circle, you can see that there is no black stuff. So on that side of the midbrain, no dopamine is being produced. This is very often the case in Parkinson's, where the signs and symptoms begin on one side as a result of loss of dopamine-producing neurons unilaterally. Here we have a brain scan showing motor areas in a healthy brain on the right side of the screen and a brain with Parkinson's on the left side of the screen. And as you can see, the motor areas in the healthy brain are much brighter and much more active than those in the brain with Parkinson's. That's due to the loss of dopamine in the brain of the person with Parkinson's. This contrasts the normal neuron production of dopamine and production of normal movement with the neuron that has Parkinson's, where there's far less dopamine, and therefore movement will not be normal. This slide shows the signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease. The 4 that are shown in bold at the top on the left side of the screen are the major signs and symptoms. These include bradykinesia, which is a slowness of movement. Movements are slow and small. Steps are short. A resting tremor, very often evident unilaterally or more obvious on one side of the body than the other, and usually most apparent in the hands. Rigidity, in which people's muscles feel stiff and tight. However, that's not the same as spasticity because it is not velocity dependent. And postural instability, in which patients tend to fall backward when you push them. You always stand behind them when you're testing this. Other common signs and symptoms are masked face. You can see that if you look at Muhammad Ali's face on the bottom of the screen. There's a lack of ability to initiate contraction of the muscles of facial expression, so people's emotions do not typically show on their faces. Micrographia, very small handwriting, and infrequent eye blink, so it looks as though people are staring, and a stooped flexed posture, which is very evident in the person shown in the picture on the top of your screen on the right. Click the link to watch somebody with Parkinson's disease on this slide. The other thing I have on here are the major treatments that can be used with patients with Parkinson's. L-DOPA, which is an abbreviation for levodopa, is a drug that is converted to dopamine inside the brain and replaces the dopamine that's missing from the substantia nigra. Dopamine agonists are chemicals that bind to and activate dopamine receptors and therefore mimic the action of dopamine in the brain. And finally, there's a great deal of evidence that shows regular exercise can slow down the progression of symptoms and maintain quality of life for people with Parkinson's for a long time. This can include treadmill walking, swimming, biking, dance, just about any exercise that gets people moving. Here's a client with Parkinson's from a research study I was involved with. Note his stooped, flexed posture and the lack of facial expression. He pretty much has that expression all the time. He also takes slow, small steps. He has obvious bradykinesia. And the other thing you really notice with Parkinson's is the lack of arm swing when walking. And if you have the Parkinson's symptoms on one side and not the other, you can often see this in just one arm. There are several different subtypes of Parkinson's, and I've listed them here. You are not responsible for knowing what is on this slide, but it is kind of interesting. What this says, too, is that there are some people who have a tremor with Parkinson's. They are the majority. But not everyone with Parkinson's has a tremor. Parkinson's disease is thought of as a motor disorder, and it is. There are a number of non-motor signs and symptoms that are common as well. The most common ones are listed on the left side of the screen. This includes loss of sense of smell, or anosmia, evident in about 80% of people with Parkinson's, depression in about half, and anxiety and dementia in about a third of people with Parkinson's. The dementia tends to come on late in the course of the disease. There are also what are called autonomic signs and symptoms shown on the right side of the screen: constipation, bladder urgency or frequency, and fatigue and sleep disorders. These go together, and the bladder problem can cause people to have to get up many times at night, which can result in the fatigue. And also pain, and we don't really have an explanation for why people with Parkinson's have pain. This slide shows what happens when the basal ganglia circuit is overactive, possibly because there's too much dopamine produced, or because dopamine receptors become overactive or too numerous. This will cause excessive stimulation of the basal ganglia, which in turn will excessively stimulate the primary motor cortex, which will send too many action potentials to the skeletal muscles by way of the upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. The signs and symptoms that this produces are described in the next few slides. In general, if you have an overactive basal ganglia circuit, you have a condition called hyperkinesia, sometimes also known as dyskinesia. Disorders associated with overactivity of the basal ganglia include schizophrenia, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette syndrome, and Huntington's disease. If you click the link, you can see somebody who has Huntington's disease, and that's also what's shown in the picture on the right side of the screen. All these people have unwanted thoughts, emotions, or movements, depending on which of the diseases they have, that cannot be inhibited. Here's a picture of a brain. You can see the normal frontal section on the bottom of the slide and the brain of someone with Huntington's disease on the top of the slide. And some of the signs and symptoms of Huntington's are shown here. They include chorea, athetosis, and dystonias. All of these are movements that are not able to be inhibited. There also can be personality changes and dementia. Huntington's disease is a genetic disease. I had an uncle who had this and died of it, and it was really terrible to watch him. And what I remember, although I was a little girl at the time, was that he had athetosis like crazy in his arms. He did slow rising movements all the time, and he could not inhibit those. You can click this link to watch Michael J. Fox, probably the most famous person with Parkinson's. In this video, he is extremely dyskinetic because he has taken too much dopamine, and so he has all these sort of rising, twitchy movements that he cannot inhibit. This is also known as hyperkinesia, which is really a better term for it, because hyperkinesia means excess movement. Our final slide is an overview showing upper motor neurons, lower motor neurons, and skeletal muscle, and then showing the three areas of the nervous system that are responsible for directing the activity of upper motor neurons in order to control skeletal muscle contraction. The cerebellum is responsible for coordination. The SMA, the supplementary motor area, is responsible for motor memory, and the basal ganglia is responsible for initiation and inhibition of movement. These three areas all act by way of upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons.